Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the presentation in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much once again for joining us. We'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. HazCom, Hazmat, Hazwaste, and Hazwhopper. Navigating OSHA, DOT, and EPA chemical compliance. Sponsored by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health. I'll be moderating today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own, do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise product or publication does not mean the council of the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. Just to let you know, this webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event due to this webcast and all of our past webcasts. Please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may also receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our presenters. With us today are Tricia Hodkovich and Michael Atkinson. Tricia has been an environmental health and safety editor at J.J. Keller since 1994 and provides content for manuals, handbooks, videos, signs, training materials, and online solutions. Tricia also writes the compliance-focused newsletter, bringing readers the latest OSHA, DOT, and EPA news. She edits publications for the construction and warehousing industry and specializes in subjects such as hazard communication, Hazwhopper, oil spills, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, signs and labels, and written plans. Tricia's articles have appeared in popular safety magazines, and she's fielded thousands of compliance questions from EHS professionals. Michael is a hazardous materials editor and joined J.J. Keller in August 2016 after more than 21 years of logistics experience in operations management, hazmat preparation, hazmat inspections, logistics, and material handling. As a hazardous materials editor, he's responsible for developing and updating content for existing manuals, online services, forms, handbooks, and software, as well as developing new products and supporting customer solutions. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Tricia, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Excellent, Alan. Thank you. So today's webcast is sponsored by J.J. Keller Chemical Safety and Compliance Solutions. Our chemical management service makes it easy by managing every step of the process, from improving the accuracy of your chemical inventory to maintaining your SDS library, ensuring proper labeling, and much more. So with the help of our industry-leading consultants and unique compliance programs, you gain the insights and assistance to reduce accidents, ensure compliance, control insurance premiums, and adopt industry best practices. Our consultants will leverage their regulatory expertise and varied industry experience to become an integral part of your safety program. So on behalf of our sponsor, thank you for joining us. So let's dig in here. So does your company manufacture, package, label, transport, store, use, dispose of, or treat chemicals? If yes, this webcast applies to you. Chemicals play a vital role in the U.S. economy. However, some chemicals pose an environmental, health, and/or safety risk during their chemical life cycles. Whether you call them hazardous chemicals, hazardous materials, hazardous wastes, or hazardous substances, these chemicals are often regulated by OSHA, DOT, and or EPA. So the fact is, the chemical standards listed on the slide remain some of the most confusing regulations covering millions of companies nationwide. This webcast explores these 4 major sets of regulations to help you better navigate the basics of chemical compliance. As with many federal regulations, it's important to note that states may be more stringent. So be sure to check your state laws and regulations to ensure compliance. And so this webcast covers the federal regulations only. Now I'll hand things over to Mike.
Awesome sauce. Thank you, Tricia. So before we begin, we thought we'd ask a poll question to find out who's attending today. So which of the following chemical operations do you have? So do you manufacture, package, transport, store, or use chemicals? How about cleaning up chemical spills? And do you dispose of or treat chemical waste? You're going to want to select all the options that apply to you, not just one, and then we'll go over the results here in a bit. So while EPA data shows that there are over 42,000 unique chemicals actively manufactured, processed, or imported into the US, the OSHA data indicates those chemicals make up almost 1.4 million different chemical products. Under OSHA HAZCOM alone, the standard covers about 85,000 manufacturers and nearly 5 million non-manufacturers. So a lot of companies have a stake in chemical-related regulations. Those regulations can be a challenge for professionals who have to interpret and comply with not just one, but many of the regulations. Hopefully today, we can give you a baseline to start untangling these regulations and help you meet some of the biggest challenges. So, thank you for participating in the poll. And here in a second, we're gonna post the results and see what we got. All right. So it looks like the majority of you guys store, followed by using chemical or responding to spills. We got a lot that dispose or treat waste, as well as labeling, marking. So we're pretty well rounded. You know, most of you guys do the storage and using chemicals. That's great. So that means this webcast is a great fit, and you should attend the entire 90 minutes if you can. We understand it's long, but if you can, stay with us the whole 90 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end, and you can submit your questions now if you need to. So here we show the parts of the chemical life cycle and which regulatory set might come into play for each chemical activity. So for example, when storing chemicals, your facility needs to worry about OSHA HAZCOM because employees can be exposed to these chemicals in normal operations or a foreseeable emergency. If you're storing hazardous waste, then the EPA has waste regulations would be a factor. And if your chemical storage area suffers an emergency response release, HAZWOPER would apply. However, simply storing chemicals does not mean DOT hazmat comes into play. This table shows you that depending on your chemical activity, you may have 2, 3, or even 4 regulatory sets to worry about at the same time.
That's right. Thank you. Excellent, Mike. So the Hazard Communication Standard, otherwise known as the HAZCOM standard, was written by OSHA to provide workers with information about the hazards of the chemicals they work with or near. So the standard is found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs, and that is at 29 CFR 1910.1200 for general industry. It's also found in other CFRs for maritime, construction, and agriculture. The HAZCOM standard adopts elements from the 3rd revised edition of the United Nations Globally Harmonized System, or GHS, which mandates a standard format for safety data sheets, or SDSs, and container labels. So under the HAZCOM standard, employers have certain responsibilities to help keep workers safe from hazardous chemicals. Keep a chemical list of all hazardous chemicals on site. Maintain and make available SDSs for each hazardous chemical on site. Ensure all hazardous chemicals are properly labeled. Implement a written HAZCOM program unless exempted. And train all employees that are potentially exposed to hazardous chemicals. If you receive shipments of hazardous chemicals that are not labeled or do not contain SDSs, you're required to obtain labels and SDSs for each chemical before use. So a chemical is any substance or mixture of substances, whereas a hazardous chemical is defined as any chemical which is classified as a physical or health hazard, a simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas, or hazard not otherwise classified. So these terms are defined in the HAZCOM standard, except combustible dust. That is defined in a compliance directive, CPL 03-00-008. And incidentally, OSHA did update that CPL earlier this year. So note that hazards not otherwise classified, or HNOC, that is an identified adverse physical or health effect that does not meet the specified criteria for the physical and health hazard classes. The OSHA HAZCOM standard does not cover every last hazardous chemical, so it pays to look over the exemptions listed at 1910.1200B6. And you'll see that there, you want to check that if there are any chemicals that are exempted, and we do summarize them here, but do look at the regulation for all the details. If you are a chemical manufacturer or importer, you're responsible for analyzing the hazardous chemicals you produce or ship. It's your responsibility to determine the hazards present in your products. So once the hazards are determined, the hazardous chemicals are classified or assigned to a hazard class, and we show the classes on the slide. Many hazardous chemicals fit into more than one class. And so, for example, a chemical could be both flammable and a carcinogen. So each hazard class is further divided into hazard categories, which are usually identified by numbers based on the degree of severity. So the lower the category number, the higher the severity within that class. As an example, the categories of flammable liquids include those listed on the slide. After the manufacturer or importer classifies all the hazards of a chemical, the information is used for generating SDSs and HAZCOM labels. Back to Mike.
Awesome, thank you. So the SDS explains what workers need to know to work safely with a specific chemical, from what it looks like and smells like to potential hazards, to what to do in the event of an incident or accident. So the slide shows the 16 sections required for the SDS, and Appendix D provides not only these 16 sections, but the subsections under each one of these. So here we thought we'd take a look at the format in chunks or groups of sections. The first group here in red is what we call the basic chemical information. And the next group of sections on the SDS, which is sections 4, 5, and 6, we're going to tend to call these the emergency information section. And in 7 and 8 here, I've highlighted those two sections, and we'll call these your day-to-day control measures. So this group, sections 9 through 11, these may pose a challenge to your employees. They might be able to understand some things like the boiling point, flash point, and maybe odor. But most of this information is geared for firefighters and emergency responders and safety professionals. You might call this the technical chemical information section. So, excuse me. Now, this group can be considered environmental and transport information. These sections are also non-mandatory. OSHA says these sections, while required internationally under DHS, are not under OSHA's jurisdiction and will not be enforced by the agency. So despite this, if your employees handle the waste or have to ship chemicals, sections 12, 13, and 14 can be very helpful if they are provided. Sections 15 and 16 round out the last group with any other information about the chemical. But one thing that is required in section 16, at least, is the date the SDS was prepared or last changed. So SDSs must be kept in your employee work areas where your employees can easily access them for as long as the corresponding chemicals are in use in the workplace. These are usually stored in binders, as you can see in the image here, or on a computer. But however you store this information, you need to make sure your employees know where the SDSs are located and how to access them without any barriers. So each hazardous chemical container must be labeled with 6 label elements before it can be shipped. And as you can see here, these elements are listed on the slide. So in certain situations, chemical containers must be relabeled. If used in-house, the chemical containers may have what you call workplace labels with at least the product identifier and the hazard information. However, if the label must have all 6 label elements listed on the previous slide, if the container will be shipped. So some situations where relabeling is permitted or required include if you choose to use a uniform workplace labeling system, when you break down a large quantity into a smaller, more portable containers that are not for immediate use, or when labels are soiled, unreadable, or missing. Pardon me. So OSHA defines a container as any bag, barrel, bottle, box, or the like that contains hazardous chemical. Pipes, engines, and fuel tanks are not considered to be containers for the purpose of HazCom. And it's important to know that any OSHA-defined container must have a HazCom label when shipped. However, if these HazCom labeled chemical containers are packaged within another container, an OSHA HazCom label is not required to appear on the outer container because that outer container would not contain a hazardous chemical. For instance, a box that contains several smaller containers of hazardous chemicals would not require an OSHA HazCom label on the box. However, each smaller container inside the box would require the HazCom label when shipped.
All right, thank you, Mike. So with some exceptions, employers must have and keep an up-to-date written HazCom program. The purpose of the HazCom program is to document in detail your plans for communicating the hazards involved with using the chemicals in your workplace. So the written program must contain information about how you will address the criteria in the HazCom standard, like SDSs and labels. Also, it must contain how you will address employee training, a list of all hazardous chemicals on site, and the methods used to inform employees of the hazards involved in non-routine tasks, and also how you inform your employees about the hazards associated with chemicals contained in unlabeled pipes. So we understand that developing a written HazCom program can be a real struggle. So if you need help in this area, we can review and update your written hazard communication program for you through our chemical management service. And with this newer service, get help from J.J. Keller experts to manage your chemical inventory and SDS library and ensure proper labeling and compliance. If you would like to learn more about the J.J. Keller Chemical Management Service, use the poll to select your interests. All right, and as a thank you, we will send you our white paper, Hazardous Chemicals 101. I don't want you to miss that. So while you make your selection, I think I will take a couple quick questions. Lots of good questions coming in, folks. Do submit your question if you have one. So someone is asking about above ground storage tanks, and do they need to have a GHS label and NFPA label on that? So for above ground storage tanks, or what a lot of folks call ASTs, when they are not storage, or I'm sorry, stationary process containers or stationary process tanks, in that case, they need to be labeled, of course. But under HAZCOM, remember we said all containers that are shipped need that GHS style label with those various label elements. When it's in-house like this, a tank, you're going to look at 1910-1200 F6, and they give you a couple options there for in-house workplace labels. And so that means those options, you can go with that GHS style label, minus the contact information, by the way. They only require the 5 elements, not all 6, or some alternative, of course. And this listener asked about NFPA. That is an alternative labeling system. You can use that too. Now, if you do have a tank that is a stationary process tank, you're going to look at a little different section, 1910-1200, paragraph F, number 7. Take a look at that to see your labeling requirements there. Let's take another quick question. Someone's asking how long they need to keep their SDSs. This is actually a popular or frequent question. So it's actually a different regulation you're going to look at for that sort of. So SDSs are considered exposure records, and exposure records, they need to be kept for at least 30 years. And OSHA allows you to keep the SDSs themselves, or you can keep 3 pieces of information, the chemical identity, where it was used and when it was used, and keep those pieces of information for 30 years. That's your choice. Again, this is a different regulation. Take a look at 29 CFR 1910.1020 for that. And certainly the SDSs that are active in use right now for the chemicals in your workplace, of course, under 1910.1200, you're going to want them readily available for everyone's there. So, all right, I think we can move on to a little bit more information about HAZCOM. So you must train all workers who may be exposed to hazardous chemicals under normal operating conditions or in foreseeable emergencies. Information and training for each worker needs to cover the elements that are listed in 1910.1200 H and J. So training is required at the time a worker is assigned to work with any hazardous chemical and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the worker's work area. For multi-employer work sites, the employer is responsible for providing updated training when its workers are exposed to new hazards, even if these hazards are created by other employers. Now, refresher training is not required annually for HAZCOM, but providing training once and assuming years later your workers are still knowledgeable is a risky assumption. Training is required to be provided at no cost to workers, and workers must be paid for the time they spend at training. The training provisions are not satisfied just by giving your workers data sheets to read. Instead, your training program is to be a forum for explaining not only the hazards of the chemicals in the work area, but also how to use the information that's generated in the program. So this can be done in many ways. Audio visuals, classroom instruction, interactive video, and online training. They're all good examples, but OSHA explains that workers must also be provided with an opportunity to ask questions and receive timely responses. The training must be comprehensible. Sometimes the chemical identity or the exact composition of an ingredient is trade secret and will not appear on the SDS. Trade secret means any confidential formula pattern, process, device, information, or compilation of information that's used in an employer's business. And that gives the employer an opportunity to obtain an advantage over competitors who do not know or use it. So Appendix E of 1910-1200 sets out the criteria to be used for evaluating trade secrets. The chemical manufacturer or importer may withhold the chemical identity and percentage of the substance in a mixture as a trade secret. However, the SDS must indicate in Section 3 that the constituents and/or exact percentages are being withheld as trade secrets. So let's take another poll. This time you will pick just one answer. What is your biggest OSHA HAZCOM challenge? If OSHA HAZCOM does not apply to you, please select the last option, and we will share the results in just a bit. So while you do that, I'll give you a little more background on HAZCOM. You may be aware that the HAZCOM standard is also known as the right to know law. Communication is what it's about. Your workers have the right to know what hazardous chemicals they work with and understand how those chemicals or hazardous chemicals can affect their health and safety. So a typical manufacturing establishment covered by OSHA HAZCOM has 22 hazardous chemicals, and a typical non-manufacturing establishment has 15 hazardous chemicals. Interesting data there. So I think we're ready for some results. Let's see what we have. Wow, okay, good participation here. So the top challenge is the written program or chemical inventory with 34%. That is followed by kind of a dead heat here for employee training at 19% and safety data sheets at 18%. So excellent results. You can see the remaining results here. Just 5% of you think that HAZCOM does not apply. So great participation. Thank you. Back to Mike.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. So this is my favorite section. I'm all about the DOT hazmat regulations. So we're going to talk about hazardous materials, or what they call hazmat, which is regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is known as PHMSA, which is an agency within the Department of Transportation, or DOT. So to make it easy for everybody and for me speaking, we'll just call this DOT. So the DOT defines hazmat as a substance or material the agency determines can pose an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property during transportation. And transportation, as it relates to hazmat, means the material can be transported by highway, rail, air, or water. So all the modes for transportation. And hazardous materials regulations, or the HMR, at 49 CFR parts 171 through 180, are federal regulations aimed to ensure that hazmat is packaged and handled safely during transport. So your workers are considered hazmat employees if, through the course of their work, they directly affect hazmat transportation safety. What does that mean? Well, that usually means it includes if they load, unload, or handle hazmat, or they design, manufacture, fabricate, inspect, mark, maintain, recondition, repair, or even test a hazmat package, container, or package component that is represented, marked, and certified or sold for use for the transportation of hazardous materials. And hazmat employees also prepare hazmat for transportation, are responsible for the safe transport of hazmat, or operate a vehicle used to transport hazmat. Now, your hazmat employees must receive specific training, including general awareness, function-specific, safety, security awareness, in-depth security if it's required, and modal-specific training. Now, training must be completed before they can perform any tasks subject to the HMRs on their own. However, there is a little what you call, I want to say loophole, but hazmat employees can perform a task prior to completing their training if they're supervised by another properly trained and knowledgeable hazmat employee. And their training must be completed within 90 days of employment or a change in their job function. So now it's the shipper's responsibility to classify any hazmat being shipped. And as you can see, we list the 9 hazmat classes on the slide. Some classes of hazmat are also broken down into divisions, but be careful because the DOT hazmat divisions are not the same as OSHA HazCom categories. So as shippers, you'll use the hazmat table to pick a shipping description that best describes the hazardous materials you're going to be shipping, right? And the proper shipping name of that hazmat is shown in column 2 of the table. Now you can read across the hazmat table and you can see the different columns that are there to find the hazard class, division, identification number, packing group, label codes, and much more information. So shipping papers are basically documents to identify hazmat that's regulated by the HMR when being offered for transportation or transported. You may also hear shipping papers referred to as a shipping order, a bill of lading, a waybill, or even a manifest. If an accident or maybe an incident occurs, the shipping papers provide not only information about what hazmat is on board, but the hazards that are involved. For each hazmat, the information listed on the slide is required. So, and that means the identification number, proper shipping name, the hazard class, and so on. And even the emergency response phone number and the shipper's certification must be provided.
Thank you, Mike. So the HMR refer to packages as bulk or non-bulk. So knowing the difference between the two helps you determine what requirements in the regulations apply to your package. So common types of bulk packages and non-bulk packages are listed on the slide. If hazmat packages are damaged, defective, or leaking, you may place them into a salvage packaging for transport, for recovery, or disposal. And also, hazmat itself has spilled or leaked from a package may be placed in a salvage packaging for transport too. So as a shipper of hazmat, you must determine the appropriate markings, labels, and placards that are required for each hazmat. Markings are required to be on outer packagings of hazmat, and the requirements apply to both bulk and non-bulk packaging. No package may be marked as hazmat unless it contains the identified material or its residue. As shown on the slide, though, the regulations require markings to be durable in English, printed on or affixed to the surface of a package or on a label, tag, or sign, displayed on a background of sharply contrasting color, like black letters on a white box. Also, they must not be concealed or hidden by labels or attachments, and they need to be located away from other markings like advertising or trademarks that could reduce their effectiveness. You've probably seen labels, the hazmat labels. They're diamond shaped and 4 inches by 4 inches in size. Labels are used in conjunction with markings on non-bulk packaging, and some bulk packaging, basically they identify the hazmat within the package. So the combination of colors, text, numbers, and symbols displayed on labels are specific to each hazard class or division. And you must ensure that the label is printed on or affixed to the outside surface other than the bottom of the package containing the hazmat. So don't hide or conceal labels. They must be easily seen. If possible, locate the label on the same surface of the package and near the proper shipping name marking. But a label may also be placed on a tag or other attachment. Hazmat placards, on the other hand, are diamond shaped and 10 by 10 inches in size. And I know placards may often be confused with labels because they look a lot alike, but of course, placards are much larger than labels. Generally, placards may be, or must, excuse me, may be displayed on each side and each end of a bulk packaging, freight container, unit, load device, transport vehicle, or rail car. So be sure to securely attach or place the placards in a placard holder and remove them if the hazard is no longer present. So just as with labels, the colors, text, numbers, and symbols displayed on placards are specific to each hazard class or division. When loading and unloading hazmat, if you and your hazmat employees should keep in mind several things here. Smoking on or near any vehicle while loading explosives, flammables, or oxidizers is forbidden. So in other words, keep all fire sources away. Be sure to take all precautions to prevent movement of the vehicle and attend cargo tanks when loading and unloading. Depending on the class or division of hazmat, you may need to shut off the engine or keep packages from getting wet. To prevent hazmat from reacting with other hazmat, the regulations also contain segregation requirements that indicate which hazmat may not be loaded, transported, or stored together. Back to Mike.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. So emergency response information, and really, unless there's an exception like there is for limited quantity materials, hazardous material shipments that require shipping papers also require emergency response information to accompany your shipment. The information on the slide must be provided for hazardous materials in the shipment. So, and that includes your basic description and technical names, immediate hazards to health, risk or fire or explosion, precautions in the event of an incident, and so on. So the DOT is really flexible in how you provide the emergency response information. So, and you can do it in one of several ways. One, you can list it directly on the hazmat shipping papers. You can keep a copy of the emergency response guidebook or the ERG with the shipping papers. Keep a copy of the appropriate guide pages from the ERG with the shipping papers, or you can keep a copy of the materials safety data sheet with the shipping papers. However, for those last two methods, really, the basic description and the technical name must be included, so that way they can identify it. Now, we know some hazmat incidents require immediate reporting. The person in physical possession of the hazmat must call the National Response Center within 12 hours if, as a direct result of hazmat, any of the incidents listed here occur during transportation, which include someone getting killed, anybody requires hospitalization due to injuries, a public evacuation lasts more than an hour, a major transportation artery or facility is closed or shut down for an hour or more, and so on. So, and you want to note that the DOT suggests really that you report anything you feel should be reported that does not meet the list. So if you have a feeling, you know what, you got a question, it looks dangerous and something might have happened and you feel it should be reported, you can go ahead and report that and they'll figure it out once you report it at the National Response Center. And also, in most cases, a written incident report is required for any unintentional hazmat release and for any incident requiring an immediate phone call to the National Response Center. So theft. Theft is a huge concern for hazmat, right? If your workers are involved in any part of the hazmat transportation process, they share in the responsibility of keeping hazmat secure until it reaches its final destination. So there are some basic recommended industry guidelines. So for establishing and maintaining a company's hazmat security, and these typically include conducting security checks of personnel and vehicles, requiring identification cards or badges for access to hazardous materials areas, maintaining accurate and updated inventories of all hazardous materials, making sure hazmat storage areas are well lit, secure, and inspected regularly. You want to make sure you're using locks, alarms, and surveillance cameras, using security guards if your company has that, and as well as conducting security checks of all hazmat packages and shipping documents, excuse me. So it's critical that your workers be continuously observant of their surroundings and the people working around them. And they want to note any unusual behavior. For example, they're going to want to watch out for unauthorized people trying to access the equipment or restricted areas, anyone appearing to be extremely nervous, agitated, or even trying to hide something, and anyone not having proper identification, unfamiliar vehicles parked where they don't really belong, and the list goes on. So if your workers witness these or any other suspicious behaviors, you want to make sure you have them reported to the supervisor immediately. All right, here we go. So here's another poll question. So tell us, what's your biggest DOT hazmat challenge? And again, you want to pick just one answer. If DOT hazmat does not apply to you, please select the last option. We'll share the results here in just a bit. So we haven't mentioned it yet, but we should say that under law, certain offerers and transporters of hazardous materials are required to register with DOT and pay a registration fee. And those are typically those people that are shipping or transporting hazardous materials that require placards. So, and this is an annual registration and fee, which is usually done by July 1st of each year or before engaging in activities requiring registration or whichever is later. These requirements are listed in the hazmat regulations under 49 CFR 107 subpart G. Now, let's see what kind of results we can get here. All right. Oh, you guys are breaking my heart. So the biggest one we have is DOT hazmat regulations do not apply to us. Oh, with 30% of you guys are breaking my heart. That's all right, because next comes hazmat employee training. We do get a lot of information and questions on those, followed by packaging, marking, labeling, or placarding hazmat. So we rounded it out pretty good. So once again, great participation, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, Mike, we had a majority though, had some sort of hazmat concern. So good participation though. Great. So let's turn to hazardous waste, or what we'll call haz waste. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, regulates haz waste under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. It follows a concept called from cradle to grave, which means that the time haz waste is generated, the cradle, until it is disposed of, the grave. It includes the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of haz waste. So the implementing federal regulations for RCRA are found at 40 CFR parts 260 through 299. And our focus here is mainly on haz waste generator requirements at 40 CFR 261 and 262. In regulatory terms, the definition of a waste is very specific. Anything you are still using or intend to use or sell is not a waste. Once you decide to dispose of it, however, it becomes a waste. Hazardous waste is defined as waste with properties that make it dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health and the environment. So under RCRA, hazardous waste are specifically defined as solid waste that meet a particular listing description or that exhibit a characteristic of hazardous waste. Solid waste then means any garbage, refuse, sludge, or other discarded material. It's worth mentioning there are other types of waste. They are listed on the slide. Universal waste on the list here, that includes batteries, certain pesticides, mercury-containing equipment, lamps, and aerosol cans. Electronic waste includes, your cell phones, circuit boards, and cathode ray tubes. Medical waste includes things like contaminated bandages, cultured dishes, contaminated needles and surgical instruments, and some body tissue and organs. So as a waste generator, you must go through a process of identifying the waste you generate and determining if it is hazardous waste. The process includes answering the following questions. Is it a solid waste? Is it an excluded solid waste? Is it a hazardous waste? Is it exempted from the definition of a haz waste? Is it a listed haz waste? And is it a characteristic haz waste? So if you know you have a solid waste, you can check the federal regulation at 40 CFR 261.41 to see if it is excluded from the definition of a solid waste. If you have a solid waste that was not excluded, you may have a haz waste. And then you can check 4 different lists in the RCRA regulations to see if it is a listed haz waste. In fact, there are over 500 listed haz waste. So even if the waste does not appear on one of the haz waste lists, it is considered hazardous if the waste possesses one or more of 4 characteristics: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. Back to Mike.
Thank you, Tricia. So it's important to know that the EPA's hazardous waste regulations apply differently depending on your what they call generator category, which is determined by how much waste your facility generates each month. The more waste you generate, the more your facility is regulated. Makes sense. So you must count all, I want to stress, all haz waste you generate toward your monthly totals. This even includes any waste generated at satellite accumulation areas, which we will touch on in a bit. Your monthly totals will determine your generator category. The regulations define 3 distinct haz waste generator categories. First, we have the very small quantity generators, or VSQGs. Then you have small quantity generators, or SQGs. And last, we have the large quantity generators, or LQGs. So the VSQGs generate the least amount of waste and are therefore the least regulated. Now, in a calendar month, VSQGs may generate up to the amounts listed in the table per month. While most waste experts agree that VSQGs should not accumulate waste on site for more than a year, they really have no accumulation time limit for shipping their waste off site. Now, SQGs may generate the amounts listed on the table per month. So if you're a SQG, you must ship waste off site within 180 days or roughly 6 months. However, if you need to ship the waste more than 200 miles because there are no nearby waste treatment, storage, or disposal facilities, you then have up to 270 days to ship it. Large quantity generators are the most regulated because they produce more than the amounts listed in their table per month. Put another way, large quantity generators don't have a limit on the amount of haz waste accumulated on site, but they are required to ship their waste off site within 90 days. So once you determine you're a waste generator and determine your generator category, the next step is to notify the EPA and the state and obtain an EPA identification number. The EPA number is used as sort of a part of a national database to track haz waste activities. So with some exceptions, small quantity generators, or SQGs, are required to re-notify EPA or their state environmental agency as to their generator status every 4 years. So if you're looking for assistance with haz waste compliance, Let one of our dedicated consultants provide you ongoing oversight of your compliance by identifying gaps and delivering continued guidance to reduce your risk from chemicals and other hazards. If you would like to learn more about the consulting services, use the poll to select your areas of interest. So, and along with your interest, we'll email you a digital copy of our popular chemical management report. So, and we'll give you time to make your selection. So I'm going to take an attendee question. And the question I got here is, can we label IBCs instead of placard them? Because technically the IBCs are a bulk package. Well, in that instance, the hazmat regulations do allow for you to label an IBC in certain situations, which means you just need the 4-inch by 4-inch label. Now, with that, you can also mark the IBC as required for non-bulk packages, meaning you have to have the proper shipping name displayed as well as the ID number. But it only has to be in the ID number only has to be in the 12mm height. So that makes it a lot easier and less expensive if you have IBCs. So if you meet the restrictions for labeling an IBC, you absolutely can do so. All right, let's get back to some EPA has waste. So if you're a VSQG or a very small quantity generator, you don't have regulatory requirements for training, but it's a best practice to train employees to handle waste safely. However, if you're a small quantity generator, you really should ensure that all your employees are thoroughly familiar with the proper, getting tongue-tied here. So let me start again. If you're a very small quantity generator, you must ensure that all employees are thoroughly familiar with the proper waste handling and emergency procedures relevant to their responsibilities during normal facility operations and emergencies. Like other parts of haz waste management, large quantity generators have more requirements around training for personnel. These LQG requirements are found in 40 CFR 262.17 A7. And if you're already providing this type of training to employees under OSHA's HAZWOPER standard, EPA says that your OSHA training will cover your large quantity generator personnel emergency response training requirements.
All right. Yeah, I think with the training slide, it's, very small quantity generator, no training, but best practice. Small quantity generator, large quantity generator, they're going to have some training under specific paragraphs listed on that slide. So great. Mike, thank you. So just as the different generator categories have different accumulation, quantity, and time limits, they also have different management requirements. Again, very small quantity generators have minimal requirements, while large quantity generators are highly regulated. So the management requirements for haz waste are lengthy, but we can boil them down. They amount to labeling and marking containers so that employees and emergency personnel know what's in them, and carefully storing waste to avoid releases to the environment or the community. Let's dig a little deeper here. So generators have two types of areas that can be used for storing haz waste. The central accumulation area, or CAA, is an area where a haz waste generator collects marked and dated haz waste. So waste in a CAA may only be accumulated for 90 days if you're an LQG, or 180 days if you are an SQG, or 270 days if being shipped more than 200 miles away for an SQG. So the waste should be accumulated in a secure area where it cannot be accessed by unauthorized or untrained employees, the public, or even animals. If you have a process where waste accumulates slowly you can take advantage of the satellite accumulation area, or SAA. An SAA allows you to accumulate up to 55 gallons of haz waste, or up to 1 quart of liquid, or 2.2 pounds of solid acute hazardous waste in containers at or near the point of generation where waste initially accumulates. So the slide here offers you safety tips for managing haz waste containers. Use a funnel or hose to transfer waste to drums. Transfer waste to a new container if you notice a container is leaking or in poor condition. Keep containers dry and cool. Clearly mark container storage areas. Keep ignitable or reactive waste in their own areas. Don't stack ignitable or reactive waste. And the list goes on here. You may want to reference this slide or any of these slides afterwards for more information here. So, but the last one, be sure to use dikes, berms, or walls, to provide secondary containment around containers in case of a leak. So haz waste containers must be labeled correctly with a hazardous waste accumulation label that includes the words hazardous waste along with the hazards of the waste. So there is no time limit for an SAA, but once you reach that 55-gallon limit, you must mark the excess with the start date, the date you began accumulating the excess waste, and either begin complying with the CAA regulations for your category, generator category, or move the excess to a CAA, or ship the waste off-site within 3 days. So you must also mark the date the waste reaches the CAA on the container as the accumulation start date. So in reality, this gives LQGs up to 93 days and SQGs up to 183 days to ship the waste off-site. Now, looking at the pink call-out box here, it does list several ways to indicate the hazards of the waste on your label. The OSHA HazCom hazard statement or pictogram is an option. DOT labels or placards are another option, among others here. So, and finally, containers must also be kept in good condition, closed except when adding or removing waste, inspected weekly, compatible with the waste being stored in them, and free of residue that could react with any new waste being added.
So hazardous waste is really a subset of DOT hazmat. So to comply with the EPA regulations, the generator needs to properly package, label, and mark all haz waste shipments and placard the vehicles used for shipping the waste according to the DOT's hazardous materials regulations. When it comes to properly marking each package of haz waste for transport, the marking must use the words we show here in the box on the slide. Now, federal EPA does not require very small quantity generators to use a haz waste manifest, but many transporters will not accept the waste without it. So if you're a small quantity generator or a large quantity generator, you must prepare and sign the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest before shipping the waste off-site. The manifest system allows you, the waste generator, to verify that your waste has been properly delivered and that no waste really has been lost or unaccounted for in the process. And you want to note that the EPA launched a hazardous waste e-manifest system nationwide in 2018. So generators, transporters, and receiving facilities have the option to create and submit manifests electronically. Now, currently, generators who are not registered in e-manifest may continue to use a paper manifest at the time. But be aware, though, because as we understand it, the federal EPA hopes to sunset all paper manifests in fiscal year 2027. To recycle hazardous waste means to reuse it or find an alternative use for it. Some ways to recycle hazardous waste are listed on the slide. Most hazardous waste may not be disposed to land unless they meet treatment standards listed in the regulations. The land disposal restrictions, or LDRs, really require waste to be treated to reduce the hazardous constituents to levels set by the EPA, or be treated using a specific technology. And hazardous waste generators are responsible for ensuring their waste is treated correctly to meet the LDR standards before it is disposed. Most generators, though, use the services of their waste disposal company or treatment, storage, and disposal facility, or TSDF, for help with their treatment options. However, small quantity generators and large quantity generators are allowed to treat their waste without a permit. And disposal is really when hazardous waste is discharged, deposited, injected, dumped, spilled, leaked, or placed into or on land or water. To dispose of haz waste intentionally, a facility will need a permit or otherwise be authorized to do so. And most of your generators, however, simply send their hazardous waste to a permitted, authorized TSDF.
All right, here's another poll for you. So again, you'll pick just one answer. And so, what's your biggest EPA haz waste challenge? If EPA haz waste does not apply to you, please go ahead and select the last option. So we will share the results in just a bit. So it is worth noting that as a haz waste generator, if your employees sign the haz waste manifest or prepare the load of waste for shipment, they are also hazmat employees. That's important. So when they sign the manifest, they are really certifying that the waste being shipped is properly classified, described, packaged, marked, and labeled, and that it is in a proper condition for transport. So that means appropriate knowledge would require successful completion of DOT hazmat training too. All right, so I'm wondering if we have some results to share. Wow, okay. Okay, wow, kind of even for the top three. So the top challenge is waste management or labeling at 22%, followed by, well, 21% of you say that the haz waste standards do not apply, and that is followed by haz waste employee training at 20%. So you can see the selections there. So, all right, so very, very good results. Good to know. We've got some folks who have haz waste and well, they have some challenges. So thank you for that participation. All right, so now for our last topic. This is my favorite, Mike, HazWhopper. So think of HazWhopper and, you know, large hazardous waste sites with workers in chemical suits. That sort of vision, that image springs to mind. Although much of the standard for hazardous waste operations and emergency response, or HazWhopper, applies to those types of waste cleanup operations, some portions of the standard apply to haz waste treatment, storage, and disposal, while still other portions apply to relatively small spills or releases of hazardous substances, not just waste, but substances at industrial or construction sites. So HazWhopper standards provide a framework for employers to protect their employees from the hazards during those operations. And so the standard emphasizes protection from hazardous substances, and this term includes EPA haz waste, DOT hazmat, biological agents, and substances regulated under an EPA law called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA for short. Looking at the structure of 1910.120 or 1926.65, which are very similar, you'll find that OSHA divided the requirements based on the type of operation or operations you have. So when we say has waste cleanup operation, we're talking about things like cleanup operations required by the government at an uncontrolled has waste site. We're also talking about RCRA corrective actions involving cleanup operations and voluntary cleanup operations at sites recognized by the government as uncontrolled has waste sites. So notice that in this table, the SQGs and LQGs may follow either paragraphs P8 or Q. Also, emergency response is not just about has waste, but also about hazardous substances. So let's take a closer look at each of these operations. Has waste cleanup operations deal with the waste by removing, containing, incinerating, neutralizing, stabilizing, clearing, processing, and or handling it. That actually is defined in the regulation, the cleanup operation. So paragraphs B through O require employers to protect has waste cleanup workers during cleanup operations and help them handle the waste safely and effectively. So paragraph B requires you to have a written safety and health program before any work can be performed on the site. During site characterization under paragraph C, the idea is to get as much detailed information as possible about all the hazards that are present. Under paragraph D, some of the elements in the site control program include preparing a site map, setting up work zones, communications, and site security. All your training requirements for cleanup personnel are listed in paragraph E of the standard. Under paragraph F, the employer provides employees with medical exams and consultations and keeps records of the physician's written opinions. Skipping to paragraph L, that goes over the requirements for emergency response involving the uncontrollable release of has waste and other hazardous substances at these sites or at these operations. Other requirements for has waste cleanup are also listed here. So has waste treatment, storage, or disposal, or TSD facilities generally operate differently than has waste cleanup sites. So for example, the TSD facilities tend to be, for the most part, fixed ongoing operations. They receive, process, store, treat, and or dispose of has waste or hazardous substances from outside sources. Employers conducting operations at TSD facilities must provide and implement the programs listed in paragraph P, which are listed here. Note that the TSD facility must develop and implement a training program for employees exposed to health hazards or hazardous substances at TSD operations. The goal is to enable these workers to perform their assigned duties and functions in a safe and healthful manner. The standard requires that a TSD facility also develop and implement a written emergency response plan, or ERP, and that is in accordance with subparagraph P8, and that is to handle possible emergencies at the facility. The exception is if the facility chooses to evacuate all employees during an emergency instead. So if that loophole is taken, the TSD must have an emergency action plan instead, not the emergency response plan, but the emergency action plan if they're going to take that loophole and evacuate everyone. And then there's a however to this. It gets kind of complex. The employer who does not or cannot take that P8 loophole about evacuation has the option to comply with either P8 or Q for any emergency response operations that are conducted in the has waste TSD area. SQGs and LQGs have has waste storage, and they're required to provide an emergency coordinator and perform emergency response. And that means these two generator types cannot take the P8 loophole. They must meet all of subparagraph P8. However, as I said, compliance with the requirements of paragraph Q is considered to be in compliance with the requirements of paragraph P8.
So as we said, emergency response operations for releases of, or really substantial threats of releases of hazardous substances must comply with paragraph Q. An emergency response is a response effort by employees from outside the immediate release area or by other designated responders, including mutual aid groups, local fire departments, etc., to an occurrence which results or is likely to result in an uncontrolled release of hazardous substance. Emergency response does not include responses to incidental releases of hazardous substances where the substance can be absorbed, neutralized, or otherwise controlled at the time of release by employees in the immediate release area or by maintenance personnel. It also does not include releases where there is no potential safety or health hazard, such as a fire, explosion, or even chemical exposure. And take a look at appendices A and B of OSHA Directive CPL 02-02-073 to find out what is considered an emergency response situation and what is just an incidental release. So employers with emergency response operations for releases of or substantial threats of releases of hazardous substances that are not otherwise covered as a haz waste cleanup site, so such as TSD, SQG, or LQG, must only comply, with paragraph Q. We list the elements of Q here on the slide. And it really should be noted that an ERP is not required by paragraph Q if employers elect to develop an emergency action plan or EAP and evaluate all employees in the case of an emergency release. Now, OSHA does require emergency response training if employees are expected to assist in the handling of an actual or potentially uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance. So upon completion of the emergency response, if it's necessary to remove hazardous substances, health hazards, and materials contaminated with them from site of the accident or incident, the employee conducting the cleanup must comply with post-emergency response operations requirements. But the employer has two choices for compliance, depending on whether only plant employees are doing the cleanup. So we get a lot of questions about HAZWOPER training. So we thought it might be handy to provide a table showing you all the requirements in one slide. You may wish to keep this keep this table for reference. So for each operation, there are different trainee types and different training requirements depending on the roles of the employees. All right. Here we go. Here's another poll question. For this one, you're going to want to select all the answers that apply. So which OSHA HAZWOPER operations apply to you? If OSHA HAZWOPER does not apply to you, please select the last option, and we're going to share the results here in just a bit. While you're making your selection, so a common question we get about the HAZWOPER is, what if the employee misses his or her anniversary for annual refresher training? So if your employee missed the date, he or she must attend the next available course. And it's a good idea really to document why the date was missed and the date that you rescheduled training. And if a substantial amount of time has passed since the initial or last refresher training, repeating initial training may be required. So, and this is really a case-by-case determination. So workers must be trained sufficiently at all times to allow them to perform their duties safely. So that should give you guys enough time. Let's see what we got. Hello. All right. So almost at neck and neck here. We have at 43% and then 41%. First, we got emergency response operations for releases of hazardous waste, and then followed by the 41% of the larger small quantity generators. Then rounding up number 3, it looks like we got a 41% as well, with HAZWOPER does not apply to us. And then has waste cleanup operations, and last but not least, permitted has waste treatment, storage, or disposal. So awesome, great results. Thank you, everybody.
Oops, sorry.
So this slide shows you what we covered today. Now we're going to turn things back to Hannah for taking your questions.
Actually, Mike, I think we have one more slide for you. I'm going to turn it over. There you are, Mike. Oh, I guess I'm up. Sorry. Here we go. So really, it looks like we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have not sent in your question, now's the time to do so. So first, I'd like to thank our event sponsor, J.J. Keller Chemical Safety and Compliance Solutions. Really, from complete management solutions to expert advisement, we provide a full range of services to help you protect employees from chemical hazards while simplifying your compliance tasks. If you missed the opportunity or joined us late, we are offering a free white paper of your choice when you request more information on our chemical safety and compliance solutions. And so use the poll on your screen, and we will be happy to send that out in the next 24 hours. And now I think we are ready to take your questions. Alan, back to you.
Well, thank you so much to you both for this wonderful presentation. And before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. Their survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. Okay, now let's get to some questions. For Tricia, with GHS at 7th or 8th edition, are there plans to move to a more modern GHS edition? I'm guessing that's asking about OSHA regulations.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay.
Definitely, Alan. They're asking about OSHA HAZCOM in the sense. And actually, there's kind of a couple questions that came in on this one. First, 7th or 8th, they're wondering if OSHA is going to update their HAZCOM regulation based on the latest GHS. And then there's another question about, do you know when we might expect the HAZCOM rule? So all this I'm going to bundle it together. So OSHA proposed a HAZCOM rule in February 2021. And OSHA says that it is close to sending that final rule for review. I checked today, it's not quite there yet. Once OSHA sends that HAZCOM final rule to the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, that office will typically take 90 or 120 days to approve it so that it can be published in the Federal Register. So hypothetically here, let's say it goes there later today or tomorrow. If the rule went to OMB, we would be looking at a publication date of somewhere around January at the earliest. And then, of course, the rule itself may have a 30 or 60-day effective date. So that pushes the compliance date, if you will, out a little, or for effectiveness. And then even the rule itself may have some what they call extended compliance dates for certain provisions of the rule. So some things might be pushed out even more. So again, we're watching that rule closely. The thing about that rule, the proposed rule in February 2021 did mention that, or work with the 7th edition of the GHS, not the, the latest. And so, we'll have to see what OSHA finally does in what requirements it adopts, what requirements it's going to kind of adopt from the GHS. So anyway, good question. OSHA is working on it. Alan.
This question is for Mike. Does a secondary hazard have to be on the container?
So in most cases, yes, a secondary hazard warning label must be within 6 inches of the primary hazard warning label on non-bulk packages. And for bulk containers like placards and that sort of thing, it's generally, in most cases, no, with the exception of, for instance, like corrosives and I believe it is nuts. It escaped my mind. Oh, radioactive materials. So yeah, in those cases for placards, no, unless you're one of those other materials. And then for labels, yes, in most cases, and it has to be within 6 inches or so of the primary warning label.
This question is for Tricia. Do we need to maintain SDS sheets for non-hazardous substances? Example, hand soap in the bathroom, office supplies, etc.
Right. So this is an important exemption you need to know about. Under HAZCOM, it covers hazardous chemicals, right? If your employees are exposed to them under normal operations or in foreseeable emergencies. But and I did have a slide early on that listed the exemptions from the HAZCOM rule. It's under 1910 to 1200 B6, a bunch of exemptions there. And one of the exemptions, I mean, you mentioned hand soap, for example. One of the exemptions to look at is what they call the consumer product exemption. And that's under, I'm looking here, B6 IX. So Roman numeral IX. And it doesn't exempt like a blanket exemption for consumer products. It only exempts them if you are using them or your employees are using them in a frequency and duration greater than the ordinary consumer. If they are using them just like an ordinary consumer at home, let's say hand soap, you wash your hands, whatever an ordinary consumer would do a few times a day, that's ordinary exposure, right? Ordinary use. But if, well, hand soap, I don't know, if you're washing your hands way a lot, another example was dish soap, for example. If you're washing the dishes, a couple times a day, well, that's ordinary consumer. But if you're washing all day, several hours a day, that's a frequency and duration more than the ordinary consumer. And so when it's beyond what an ordinary consumer would be doing, then it is covered by HAZCOM. You need the SDSs, you need the training, the labeling, the whole 9 yards.
This question is from Mike. What liability do we have on proper vehicle placards when we use a third-party transport?
So for placarding, the hazardous materials regulations leave it up to the original shipper to provide the placards to the drivers, to the carrier. Now, if at that point, it's the carrier or driver's responsibility to make sure that the placards are properly placed on the vehicle. Now, if, for instance, there's a transship point or whatnot, that is between the two carriers, and generally it's the carrier accepting the hazardous materials for transportation to properly placard that load.
Okay, this question is for Tricia. To clarify, for a list of chemicals on site, do all chemicals require being on an inventory list? For example, WD-40, or is this more directed to bulk tier 2 chemical inventory?
Okay, so under HAZCOM, it's not divided by bulk or non-bulk, none of that. It's whether you have a hazardous chemical by definition, and that is defined in the regulation. And once and your employees are in fact exposed or maybe exposed under normal conditions of use or in a foreseeable emergency. So once you find, okay, got these covered hazardous chemicals, then you check for exemptions, and if they are exempt, okay, you can forget about them. But if they are not exempt, so non-exempt hazardous chemicals, all of them need to be on your chemical inventory, and then that chemical inventory needs to be in your written plan. So don't think bulk or non-bulk, think hazardous chemical. look at the exemptions. Good question.
The next question, what about passenger buses carrying oxygen tanks for passengers using them? Do they require hazmat regulations?
If the passengers are actively using the oxygen or what have you, then no, they don't really have to follow. However, if you're carrying extra oxygen tanks, like say on a bus in the storage compartment down below, then there are regulations regarding that in 49 CFR 177. So you would have to follow those and keep those secure. And if they're cylinders, you have to make sure that the cylinders are protected as well.
Question is for Tricia. While transporting hazardous waste barrels, do all employees responsible in the movement of the barrels need to review the SDS? Even employees just using a ratchet strap to secure the load to a forklift?
Okay, so when this attendee mentioned SDSs and reviewing of the SDSs, and when I think SDSs, I think HAZCOM, OSHA HAZCOM. And the thing about HAZCOM is one of the exemptions is for hazardous waste. So under HAZCOM, you're not required to keep SDSs for your hazardous waste. So then I would stretch that out to say your employee is not required to review SDSs because you're not required to have them, right? But so it's not covered by HAZCOM. But just to think about it, hazardous waste there are some training requirements for small quantity generators and large quantity generators for those employees that are handling the hazardous waste or an emergency situation responding to that. It is also best practice for very small quantity generators to train their employees with that. And you mentioned shipping or transport. There may very well be some hazmat training involved when you're about to ship or transport that hazardous waste. So there are some training requirements, but SDSs and HAZCOM does not apply to hazardous waste.
Our next question for Mike. Someone asking, do you need to consider colorblind people when it comes to labeling?
Wow, that's a great question, and it's one that I've never had before. But the answer is yes. So when you're providing these colorblind employees, or if you know the employees are colorblind and you're giving them training on how to identify them and whatnot, the hazmat labels and placards, for that matter, they're really designed so that someone that is colorblind can still identify them, right? Because if you look at the hazmat label or placard, one, they have an image on them, and that image will tell you what it is, regardless of the color. And there's also a number. If you look at the bottom of each label or placard, there's a number on there. Between that number and that image, you can determine what the hazard is. And for the most part, when shipping in the U.S., most U.S. hazard warning labels and placards are worded, so it's usually written on there as well for them to determine what that hazard is.
So we have time for about one more question, maybe. Tricia, can you address the requirements for employees in regards to incidental spills versus emergency spills?
Sure, we did bring up incidental versus emergency response releases or spills in our HAZWOPER discussion. We had a whole slide there on emergency response operations and some examples. And so I would direct everybody to that particular slide with those examples, but also to that directive we mentioned, the OSHA directive CPL 02-02-073, and that is on that slide, that number there. And specifically look at appendices A and B. OSHA goes into several pages of discussion on the difference between incidental and emergency, and some of those gray areas where you're not quite sure, and it kind of gives you a better idea of how to handle those gray area type spills. So great question.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Fortunately, we have run out of time. I'd like to thank our awesome presenters, Trisha Hodkovich and Michael Atkinson, the entire team from our sponsor, JJ Keller, of course, all of you who joined us today. Take care and have a safe day.